Hey there, my name's Ahmed, and today I'll be talking about the movements and injuries regarding the mid-range shot. Together with my partner Fergie, we've compiled a bunch of slides which showcases all the phases included in a jump shot, also showing the anatomical changes and positions included with that. And we'll discuss the injuries present after. But before we get started into that, let's discuss what a mid-range shot actually is. It's a very common method of scoring in the sport of basketball, and the criteria you have to meet is being inside of the three-point line, and making one of these baskets gives you 2 points. Often this shot is heavily contested as you are very close to the basket, which increases the risk of injury. Let me show you guys an example of me shooting a mid-range shot. This is pretty much a complete run through and you can see all phases included in the movement. But now let's break it up. The first step of shooting a mid-range shot is the setup phase. This is pretty much a preparation for your actual jump shot. The setup phase can be done with and without the ball, as it mainly involves locking your eyes to the rim and getting ready to catch and shoot. For this, your knees are slightly flexed. This gives your body a better balance and a much stronger overall base. The wrist is also slightly flexed around the ball. This is so you can get an actual grip of the ball to hold it. And later on, as you bring the ball up to the set point, the wrist is then extended to shoot the ball. The elbow joint is also slightly flexed. This is the movement prior to bringing it to the set point, which is then fully flexed. And for the second phase of shooting a mid-range, you have the load phase. This is where you bring the ball up to your set point, which is near the forehead for most people. And you're essentially loading up and getting ready to shoot the ball. It's pretty clear that flexion is a lot more apparent in this phase, as the knees are flexed in much more than the previous time. And same for the elbow, as the ball is much higher up. But now in contrast, the wrist is extended instead of flexed. This is so it's ready to launch the ball instead of holding it down. It also allows you to launch the ball farther as you can add a spin. Moving on to one of the most crucial phases is the force producing phase. This is where you release most of the power you built up, and it's the last point where you actually have contact with the ball. This can often be mixed up with the release point, but it's pretty much the step in between that. The knee joint is almost completely extended, along with the elbow joint to give as much power as possible. Although the wrist is in a certain neutral position, as it's not really flexed or extended. This is to give a ball a certain point of direction and also guide it towards the rim. Now the release point is when you actually release and shoot the ball. This is when you're jumping to the peak of your height and essentially launching the ball forward. With this movement, you can see almost every muscle part straightens out, and that's to maximize all the power. And here you can see a close-up of what actually goes on during the release phase. The wrist is flexed a lot to add backspin to the ball, and elbows extended to give as much power as possible. At this point, the knees are fully locked out and extended, as well as the elbow joint, which is also fully extended. The extension of the elbow is better for close range shots, as it allows for a higher set point to shoot over other opponents, but in respect, it doesn't allow you to shoot as far. And after that, it takes us to our last step, which is the follow through. Although some forget about this is a crucial step for every mid-range shot, and it's often a deciding factor whether your shot goes in or not. During the follow through, your shooting arm elbow stays fully extended, whereas your guide hand elbow stays flexed. This is to ensure the ball goes through a straight path. As for the wrist, it stays in a flexed position and holds it. This ensures as much backspin on the ball as possible, while also guiding it to the position you want. And as for the knee, it does flex a little bit, and this is due to the impact when you land after shooting a jump shot. If you don't flex your knee a little bit, it could cause a lot more injuries when landing. A very common injury in basketball is an ACL tear, which often occurs when a player lands wrong after shooting. Although tearing your ACL is pretty uncommon, and most likely not going to happen to people if you take a jump shot, an ankle sprain can be much more likely. This takes place when an ankle inversion happens, and personally this has happened to me twice while playing basketball. One time I landed on someone's foot, and the other time I actually broke my foot with this injury. These are the different grades associated with an ankle sprain, and I'd say the most common one is a grade 1. This comes from a little slip up and leads to swelling. Now let's talk about some of the steps you can take to recover from one of these injuries. Now many doctors will tell you the acronym RICE, which stands for Rest, Ice, Compression, and Elevation. Although it did work in the past, this is very outdated, and we found that movement is much more helpful to recover from this injury. Even if that means casting up and moving around, and doing any sorts of range of motion or flexibility. Of course, if it hurts, you should not do these. In that case, it's best to ice until the swelling stops, but movement is key if you want to return to activity as soon as possible. As long as you're comfortable with it, any sorts of stretching is helpful. The ankle sprain normally takes place in this part of the movement, and since the mid-range shot is always heavily contested, if you land on someone's foot, there's a high chance you could sprain your ankle. So if you're known to have weak ankles, playing in an ankle brace can prevent this injury, as it provides the ankle with much more support.